Welcome to Fun Facts Online. Today, we're diving into a story about how the modern world was built. Not with bricks and mortar, but with stocks, debt, and a revolutionary, dangerous idea. We're going back to the early 1700s, to a time of two of the most spectacular financial crashes in history, the Mississippi Bubble in France and the South Sea Bubble in Great Britain. These weren't just stories of investors losing their shirts. These events are the secret origin story of modern nations, built on a system of what we can call financial colonialism. A system where stock market fortunes were directly tied to the brutal exploitation of colonies and the transatlantic slave trade. This is how the abstract world of finance forged nations and created a global economic order that still echoes today. To understand how this happened, we first need to understand the mindset of the 18th century. The dominant economic theory was mercantilism. European powers saw global wealth as a fixed pie. For one nation to get a bigger slice, another had to get a smaller one. National power was measured in physical gold and silver, and the only way to hoard it was to export more than you imported. And what was the key to this strategy? Colonies. Colonies were your exclusive source for raw materials and a captive audience forced to buy your finished goods. The primary tools for this imperial project were the chartered companies. Think of them as the original public-private partnerships, granted royal monopolies on trade, the right to build forts, and even the power to wage war. They were corporations acting as arms of the state. The British and Dutch East India Companies had already shown how incredibly profitable this model could be, and it was this blend of corporate greed and imperial ambition that set the stage for the chaos to come. Now, let's turn to the year 1711. Both Great Britain and France were drowning in debt. Decades of constant warfare, especially the War of the Spanish Succession, had left their treasuries empty. Both governments were desperate for a solution, and both, remarkably, landed on a similar, radical idea. In Britain, the government created the South Sea Company. The plan was deceptively simple. The government had a massive pile of debt owed to its citizens. The South Sea Company would take on a huge chunk of this debt. In exchange, the government would pay the company a guaranteed 6% annual interest. The original debt holders were encouraged to swap their government bonds for shares in the company. So instead of a clunky government IOU, you now owned a slice of a dynamic new enterprise. But the real sizzle wasn't the guaranteed interest. The company was granted a monopoly on all British trade with the fabled South Seas, Spanish America. This was the land of gold and silver mines, the source of Spain's legendary wealth. The prospect of tapping into this market, combined with the steady government payments, made South Sea stock seem like a can't-miss investment. Across the English Channel, France was in even worse shape. When King Louis XIV died in 1715, he left the nation effectively bankrupt. Into this crisis walked a charismatic Scottish financier and convicted murderer named John Law. Law had a revolutionary theory. A nation's wealth isn't its gold, but its economic activity, which could be supercharged with a ready supply of money. In 1716, he established a bank with the authority to issue paper money, a new concept for the French. A year later, he founded what became known as the Mississippi Company. Just like its British counterpart, the Mississippi Company was tasked with taking over France's national debt. Citizens traded their government bonds for company shares. And just like the South Sea Company, it had a colonial promise. The company held a monopoly on trade with France's enormous, undeveloped North American colony of Louisiana. John Law, however, was far more ambitious. He merged his bank and his company, envisioning a future where this single entity would control all of France's colonial trade, its tax collection, and its money supply. He marketed Louisiana as a paradise on earth, a land overflowing with gold, silver, and fertile soil, just waiting to make investors rich. The public was captivated. But these promises of colonial riches weren't just marketing hype. They were built on a concrete and brutal system. This is the heart of the machine. Financial colonialism, the use of modern financial tools, stocks, public debt, speculation, to directly fund and profit from the exploitation of colonial land and people. And at the dark heart of this system was the transatlantic slave trade. The South Sea Company's most valuable asset was a contract called the Asiento de Negros. This was a monopoly granted by the Spanish crown to supply its American colonies with enslaved Africans. The contract, won by Britain in the treaty that ended the war, was seen as the golden key to unlock the closed markets of Spanish America. The company was authorized to import 800 enslaved men, women, and children every year for 30 years. The immense profits expected from selling human beings were a core part of the pitch to investors in London. While the company often contracted out the horrific work, records show that between 1715 and 1739, the South Sea Company was directly responsible for trafficking over 34,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The direct profits were often less than hoped, but the symbolic value of the Asiento in fueling the stock bubble was immeasurable. It was the tangible link between a stock certificate in London and a human life destroyed in the Americas. In France, John Law's Mississippi Company was built on the same foundation. To make Louisiana profitable, it needed people. The company's charter required it to transport thousands of European settlers and enslaved Africans to the colony. To meet its quotas, the company resorted to rounding up the poor and marginalized from the streets of Paris and shipping them to Louisiana against their will. Many died from disease and starvation. The company also held the monopoly on the slave trade to Louisiana. Between 1719 and 1731, it transported over 6,000 enslaved Africans from West Africa to work on tobacco and indigo plantations. Their forced labor was the engine that was supposed to generate the profits investors were dreaming of. The company's administration also implemented the infamous Code Noir, or Black Code, a set of laws that defined enslaved people as property, cementing the foundation of Louisiana's brutal slave society. This colonial project was also devastating for the indigenous peoples. The influx of Europeans and Africans led to violent conflict over land. The Natchez Revolt of 1729 was a direct response to this invasion, and the French, in turn, waged a war of extermination that virtually wiped out the Natchez Nation. Fueled by these promises of colonial wealth, backed by governments and amplified by clever marketing, the stock prices for both companies went ballistic. In Paris, the Rue Quincampoix became the epicenter of a speculative mania. People from every class of society, from dukes to their servants, scrambled to buy shares in the Mississippi Company. The price of a single share exploded from 500 livres to over 10,000 livres. The word millionaire was coined here to describe the newly rich. London's Exchange Alley saw the exact same frenzy. South Sea stock, trading at around £128 in January 1720, shot past £1,000 by August. The fever was so intense, it spawned dozens of other scam companies, promising to fund bizarre projects like a machine for perpetual motion or a way to extract sunshine from cucumbers. To keep the party going, both companies offered to lend people money to buy their own stock, creating an artificial loop of demand. They bribed politicians and journalists to sing their praises. The public was caught in a classic feedback loop of herd mentality, convinced that prices could only go up. But they couldn't. By mid-1720, the share prices were completely disconnected from reality. The promised colonial profits were nowhere to be found. A few smart investors started quietly selling their shares. The feeling of unease began to spread. The crash, when it came, was sudden and total. In France, worries about the sheer volume of paper money John Law had printed led to a run on his bank. People demanded gold and silver for their banknotes. Panic set in. The value of Mississippi Company shares vaporized, and it took the entire French financial system down with it. In London, the South Sea Company, in an attempt to crush its smaller rivals, pushed Parliament to pass the Bubble Act, which made it harder to start new companies. This backfired spectacularly. It created a general panic, and as everyone rushed for the exits, the South Sea bubble burst. This wasn't just a local disaster. It was the world's first international financial crisis, sending shockwaves across all of Europe. The aftermath of these crashes is where our story takes its most important turn, because the fallout fundamentally reshaped Britain and France in completely opposite ways. In Britain, the crash caused a massive political scandal. The public was furious. A parliamentary inquiry exposed widespread bribery and corruption, and the company directors had their assets seized. From this chaos, one man rose to restore order: Robert Walpole. Walpole skillfully managed the crisis, punishing the worst offenders but protecting the government and the monarchy. He effectively became Britain's first prime minister. But here's the paradox. Walpole's government engineered a bailout that actually made the British state stronger. The company was restructured, and the Bank of England stepped in. Most importantly, Britain's national debt, which had been the source of the whole problem, was consolidated and stabilized. This gave the British government a secure financial footing that would become a massive advantage in its future wars with France. The crisis also led to better financial regulation, laying the groundwork for London as a global financial center. In France, the result was the exact opposite. The collapse of the Mississippi bubble wasn't just seen as a company failure, it was seen as a failure of modern finance itself. The French public developed a deep, lasting distrust of paper money, national banks, and stock markets. This suspicion crippled France's economic development for the rest of the century. The French monarchy was forced to go back to its old, inefficient, and corrupt methods of raising money. The government's financial weaknesses only got worse, creating the very fiscal crisis that would, in 1789, ignite the French Revolution. So the story of the South Sea and Mississippi bubbles is far more than a simple cautionary tale. It's the story of the birth of the modern nation-state, powered by a new kind of financial engine. These innovations, public debt, stock markets, joint stock companies, provided the capital for European imperial expansion. The financial system that emerged in Britain after the bubble, hardened by the crisis, helped it become a global superpower. The system that failed in France, and the resulting distrust, contributed to the collapse of its monarchy. But we must never forget the cost. The forging of these modern nations, the wealth that flowed into London and Paris, was extracted through unimaginable violence. This system of financial colonialism was built on the enslavement of millions of Africans and the dispossession of indigenous peoples. The foundations of our modern global economy were laid not just in the stock exchanges of Europe, but in the holds of slave ships and on the ravaged landscapes of the Americas. That is the complicated, dark, and undeniable fun fact for today. Thanks for listening to G Fun Facts Online.